G'day, May 40 here. So is Israel winning or losing? We're now a year and a day since Hamas's October 7, 2023 attacks on southern Israel, in which about 1,200 Israelis died and another 250 were taken hostage. And so there are opinions all over the map. John Mearsheimer, of whom I have great respect, says that Israel's just getting deeper and deeper into a quagmire. So effectively, Israel, by fighting and not making any progress towards its goals, is losing. And then there are many analysts, such as Michael Doran from the Hudson Institute, is a Middle East expert, who says that Israel is succeeding, Israel's making progress, and there is a lot of chatter online about how Israel has degraded about 50% of Hezbollah's arsenal. So is Israel winning, losing, staying the same? And I think one valuable metric is look at the feet, right? The feet are the most honest part of the human body. So you can tell if someone really wants to speak to you by the direction of their feet. If their feet are pointed towards you, then they're likely interested in being engaged with you. But if their feet are pointing away from you, they want to get away from you. So that was a point in a book I read on body language, that the feet, the most honest part of the body. So I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, most Israelis who fled the south of Israel after the Hamas attacks have now returned to the south of Israel. So let's say 90% of the residents who lived near Gaza have returned. Then perhaps that would be a good metric for saying that Israel's attack on Hamas in Gaza has been 90% successful. If only 40% of Israeli residents of southern Israel near Gaza have returned, then that would be a good metric for saying that Israel's only achieved a 40% level of success. Israel has now publicly stated that within about a month, the residents of northern Israel will be able to return. So about 70,000 Israelis fled northern Israel after Hezbollah began shelling northern Israel October 8th. So if 20% of these residents return to their homes, then I think you could say that Israel's northern strategy has been 20% effective. If 50% return, then it's been 50% effective. Also, there's the wider question, what about Israel's best and brightest? So those Israelis with an IQ over 130, they likely have more income, more options in life, more education, and more elite skills than your average Israeli. And they likely contribute far more to the tax base and to the country overall than they take out in government services. So since October 7, 2023, of these elite Israelis with IQs over 130, right, how many have left Israel compared to how many who have moved to Israel? So my sense of things is that Israelis with IQs over 130 have left Israel more than they've arrived in Israel. And so that would be an indication that Iran's strategy of strangling Israel is winning. I would think that the Israeli who has left Israel since October 7, 2023 is more educated, has more income, has more elite skills, and is higher IQ, and has more options in life, and has a higher upside than your average Israeli. Right? Immigration, or even moving out of your country, is a daunting prospect, but the higher your IQ, the more likelihood that you have the skills, the education, the social ties, social intelligence, and the resources to be able to successfully pull off a move. So Israel's economy is in trouble. Moody's gave it a dramatic downgrade in the past month. And one concrete measure of Israel's military strategy will be our more elite Israelis, right? People with IQs over 130, are more elite Jews moving back to Israel, or are they moving out of Israel? And so thousands of Israeli businesses are in trouble or bankrupt because their owners have had to serve in the Israeli reserves in Israel's many wars right now. So virtually all of the non-Haredi Israeli men between about the ages of 18 and 50 have to serve in the armed forces. Usually it's a couple of weeks a year. But in a time of war, you can be caught up for months on end where you can't tend to your business. And so there are tremendous sacrifices required to be an Israeli citizen, right? There is a vulnerability to being attacked, to being blown up, that often feels much more intense in Israel than, say, in the United States. Now, in the wake of October 7, many Israeli Jews felt insecure and many American Jews felt insecure and vulnerable for the first time. Now, that's not based on facts on the ground, right? There is not a dramatic surge in murders of Jews in the United States. Right? There's been a moderate surge in quote-unquote anti-Semitic incidents, but that can mean so many different things. I'm not sure it's a particularly valuable statistic. But every Jew who chooses to remain a Jew, right, in the wake of the Holocaust, in the wake of October 7, is willing to pay the price of the vulnerability that comes with being Jewish, along with the privileges of being Jewish. And so another measure of Israel's war strategy success is, are Jews in the diaspora more or less or equally likely to stay identifying as Jews? So right now I'm walking the mean streets of Westwood and I'm wearing a yarmulke. I am a convert to Orthodox Judaism. I'm a Zionist. And wearing a yarmulke is a signal that is costly. Right? There is a level of behavior that is expected of someone who wears a yarmulke publicly everywhere he goes. You're expected to live up, certainly publicly, to the standards of Orthodox Judaism. And that significantly restricts your choices in life. You're held to a demanding standard, and it is off-putting to many people, both Jewish and non-Jewish. Right? You get into an Uber, and if your Uber driver is wearing a yarmulke, right, that may provoke some negative feelings in you. It can create a disequilibrium. Right? It is out of the ordinary. Most people don't wear such a published religious insignia on their heads, right? And by you visibly, defiantly against social norms, standing up for a particularly controversial system, such as Orthodox Judaism, people tend to have strong opinions on Orthodox Jews, both pro and con, right? You are simultaneously challenging those around you. So by virtue of my publicly noting my allegiance to Orthodox Judaism, it's a challenge to the belief structures of those around me. And it causes other people to reflect on what do they believe, what do they stand for, how do they feel about someone making such a defiant stand for a particular hero system and a particular tribe and a particular way of life. For years, I wore a yarmulke that had FIDF on it, Friends of the IDF, Friends of the Israeli Defense Forces. And it never occurred to me during that time that it was kind of weird for me as an American citizen to be publicly displaying head covering that showed my friendliness towards the armed forces of a foreign country. And when that thought hit me, I stopped doing it. Because I believe that any healthy country puts out strong signals that socially and publicly it's unacceptable to display a greater loyalty to a foreign nation rather than to the United States of America. But in a sense, by wearing a yarmulke on my head, I am signaling a loyalty that someone would see as in conflict with American norms or with American nationalism. And I'm also making myself much more of a visible target for those who have negative feelings about Jews. So if I were Arab or if I were Muslim, if I were Lebanese or Palestinian or Jordanian or of Egyptian heritage, Iraqi heritage, Iranian heritage, and I was following the events in the Middle East, all right, I likely would have some intense negative feelings about what's going on, and there could very well be intense negative feelings about what Israel's doing. If it's true that there are approximately 40,000 deaths in Gaza, right, that's a heartbreaking number of deaths. And proponents of Israel, right, people using Hasbara, meaning pro-Israel talking points, say, well, these deaths are entirely due to the tactic of Hamas of hiding behind civilians, and it's entirely Hamas's fault that you have these civilian deaths, that if Hamas would just lay down their arms, would stop hiding behind civilians, these civilian deaths would not occur. And so it is grandstanding and conspicuous compassion to be mad at Israel for these 40,000 Gazan deaths. But I could understand why somebody would have a different point of view and have a negative reaction to Israel's campaign in Gaza. And a very common talking point might be, well, yeah, Israel lost 1,200 of its citizens on October 7, 2023, but now they've killed 40,000 Gazans, and this is just disproportionate, violates international humanitarian law. It's outrageous, it's a genocide. I understand why someone would feel that way. And then, while Israel's at war, and while Israel's conducting a bloody attack strategy in Gaza, right? Someone publicly walking around wearing a yarmulke would very likely attract a negative reaction from those who are outraged by Israel's choices. So there are many advantages to Jews in having a Jewish state, but there are also many disadvantages. As the Torah says, this is a blessing and a curse. So almost everything is a blessing and a curse. I would hope that for most people marriage is a blessing, but there's also a limitation of choices and a sense that you are stuck with someone with whom you would not always want to be stuck with. And so marriage has to be a blessing and a curse. For people with a good marriage, it's much more of a blessing than a curse. Parenthood, right? Just imagine your child makes bad choices, or your child's on a bad trajectory in life, or your child is unhappy, right? That would feel like a curse as a parent. So parenthood has to be a blessing and a curse. And for the fortunate parent, right, parenthood is much more of a blessing than a curse. But for a significant number of parents, parenthood is more of a curse than a blessing. And so it's exciting in Jewish life, and it's rewarding, And there is a sense of enthusiasm and of safety to have a Jewish state. But that blessing comes at a cost. It comes with the curse of everything that the Jewish state does then has the potential of reflecting back on you. You can't just take all the great things about having a Jewish state and skip all the prices paid. So if Israel is reckless in the way it wages war, if Israel is unjust, if Israel is cruel, if Israel is careless, if Israel is stupid, right? If Israel is selfish, if Israel is heedless in the way it conducts its wars, then that's going to have negative ramifications for those who identify as Jewish. So I heard Dennis Prager say that if we didn't have the modern state of Israel, which began in 1948, there would be only half as many identifying Jews in the world. That having a Jewish state gives Jews an incentive to identify as Jewish and to perhaps lead a Jewish life or to grow in that identity. People tend to put more emphasis on identities that they are proud of. So if Israel conducts its wars in a way that makes a Jew feel ashamed, right, they are going to be strongly incentivized to decrease the importance that they give to their Jewish identity. We all have many identities. Right, we have the identity of a son, as a sibling, as one partner in a relationship or in a marriage. We live in a geographic area, we have a profession, we have a religion, we have political allegiances, sporting allegiances. And so one trend that you see in Europe and the United States is that people in the working class are increasingly moving out of the working class identity, feeling that it is of low prestige, towards what they see as a more prestigious identity, and that is nationalism. So the working class Englishman may increasingly identify with his English identity and thus be more likely to vote Tory, traditionally the party of the upper class. And those whose primary identity is working class as opposed to nationalist, right, they'll probably be more likely to vote for Labour and the left of centre party. And so the Republicans have increasingly become the party of the working class. But that's been accompanied by a surge in American nationalism. So I think many American workers may not primarily identify by their social class, but by their national allegiance. And so the pitch of Make America Great Again speaks to their American nationalism, and it might outweigh their traditional working class predispositions towards voting for the Democratic Party. So if Israel conducts its wars in a successful, stunning fashion, then that would have a knock-on effect so that more Jews will feel proud of their Jewish identity and be willing to sacrifice for it and to build on it. And if Israel is as hapless as it appeared on October 7, right, that would encourage many Jews and would be allies of Jews to have less enthusiasm towards Jewish identity, Jewish nationalism. If Donald Trump behaves in embarrassing fashion, then people are less inclined to identify as Republican and to vote Republican. When Donald Trump outshines his political opposition, then people are more likely to identify with Donald Trump, his movement, and with the Republican Party. So when we are moving up in social status, in effectiveness, when our prosperity is increasing, right, people are more likely to want to hang out with us. And when we get into a downward spiral, then people are more likely to avoid us. Is this the UK? No, this is Westwood, California, in Los Angeles. I have negative feelings of any group that mutilated the genitals of their children. Maybe just don't wear a yarmulke to avoid any hate from the opposite side. Yes, so that would be an option that has some strong arguments on its side. Like, why would one needlessly, gratuitously wear a symbol such as a yarmulke that is likely to attract opprobrium from strangers and people you know, right? Well, it's a costly signal, so it's a little bit like certain types of male bucks, right? That's a variety of deer. So male bucks will often grow prodigious antlers that will consume up to 30% of the calories that they take in. And so building these gigantic set of antlers is very costly. But the bigger, the more impressive your antlers, the higher your odds of having sex with female deer. On the other hand, during a time of limited resources, right, you are more vulnerable to starving to death because your antlers require so much nutrition. So with wearing a yarmulke, it's a costly signal, right? There's a big price to pay for wearing a yarmulke, but that in turn shows that you have a high commitment to a particular in-group identity and enhances your status within that tribe. So we're all sending out costly signals, right? We can't help but invest considerable resources in impression management because we can't get through life effectively on our own. We never know when we might need help from other people. So right now I could trip, hit my head, and pass out. And perhaps the only way I might survive is if people call 911 promptly and an ambulance comes and picks me up. I've had times where my back has just gone out on me and I'm unable to function. I need other people. Or I've had to apply for a job, or I've had to secure new clients, or I'm just feeling down and depressed and hopeless, and I need to be able to talk about highly charged things going on with my life. I need other people. So we all need other people, and by showing these costly signals of our commitment to a particular in-group identity, right, we enhance our success within that in-group at a price of our success with out-groups. So generally speaking, the more religious the Jew, the less intense and the fewer the interactions they have with non-Jews. Right? The more intense your in-group identity, usually the less effective you will be at building ties with out-groups. Because when you have an intense in-group identity, you are displaying all sorts of highly costly signals about your in-group identity that deter and turn off members of out-groups. I read an article in Foreign Policy magazine about functional and dysfunctional violence. And Israel is an incredibly small state. I think at one point it's only about 9 miles wide. And so Israel is not easy to defend. It doesn't really have a coherent defensive structure without seizing parts of the West Bank. So due to international concerns and internal concerns and problems that would inevitably arise from explicitly seizing parts of the West Bank, which Israel conquered in the 1967 war, but Israel has not officially made it part of the Jewish state of Israel. Instead, Israel is engaged in an occupation over millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. All right, Israel faces many incentives to not officially seize land in the West Bank. At the same time, it faces the reality that the nation state is very, very difficult to defend without effectively taking control of large swaths of the West Bank. So we face these incentives in our own life. If we say explicitly what we want, we will often be less likely to get it. And so we often say things that are the very opposite of what we do. Right? Because the incentive structure is such that to say explicitly what we want will work against our best interests. And think of the typical workplace, right? The employer wants to extract as much income-producing work from his employees as possible, while employees generally feel incentivized to do as little work as possible for as much pay as possible. Not many people put on their resumes that they're selfish and lazy, yet almost everybody has significant predispositions towards selfishness and laziness. People on dating apps set filters, so they might not be interested in, say, women over 39. And women may put on a filter that they're not interested in dating men who are shorter than 5'10". And so often people will lie on their dating profiles to increase their chances. And so a 42-year-old woman will put on a dating profile that she's really 39, and a 5'7" man may put on his profile that he's really 5'10". And so people are engaged in lying to try to maximize their own best interests and hope that they'll be so compelling when they meet and the other party finally realizes the truth that it might work out. So there is functional and dysfunctional violence carried on by Jewish settlers on the West Bank, according to this foreign policy article. So functional violence is that which aids the aims of the state. And this could be applied to individuals and to groups. Right? Black Lives Matter engaged in violence over the years, and it was functional violence when it worked to the advantage of the aims of Black Lives Matter, and it was dysfunctional violence when it worked against the aims of Black Lives Matter, such as it almost got Donald Trump reelected in 2020. And so much of the settler violence on the West Bank has driven Palestinians from their communities, from their villages, from their land, and has been a de facto Jewish annexation of lands and villages that Palestinians have for a long time regarded as rightfully theirs. Now, there's also dysfunctional settler violence on the West Bank, and that's when settler violence saps the resources of the IDF, when it makes Jews and the Jewish state look bad, when it works against the aims of the Jewish state. So the IDF in the West Bank, it operates as a matrix, not as a hierarchical organization on the West Bank. And so it operates not 100% in accord with its stated mission, because Israel is strongly incentivized not to abide by stated mission of autonomy and safety for Palestinians, but to abide by its own national security interests, which mean annexing large swaths of the West Bank to make Israel more secure and more defensible. So in dating, honesty early on in a relationship can be dangerous for your functional goal of forming a relationship with someone, because when we first get to know someone, we are usually predisposed to say no, right? Almost all of us are predisposed to say no to almost everything. And so if you are honest early on in a dating relationship and reveal something that many people will just instinctively remove you from their life over, then that's likely acting against your self-interest. On the other hand, if you develop a duplicitous reputation with this potential partner, that's not good either. So people recognize the significant trade-offs with disclosure and telling the truth, as opposed to reputation management. Imperialist nations judging Israel as classic. Well, anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism is usually just a fancy way of saying that you hate white people, because anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist rhetoric is never trained against the colonialism and imperialism carried out by non-white peoples. Now, why do peoples and nations engage in hypocrisy? Why do they say one thing and do another? Because often that's in their best interests. And so if you want to belong to the ruling elite, whether in Australia or the United States or France or Germany, right, the ruling elite is heavily predisposed towards an anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, anti-white worldview. Your government did the same thing Israel is doing, and that's directly improve your quality of life. Right, so people tend to lie and dissemble in their own interests. And often when someone says, I made a mistake, you'll notice they have a pattern of making mistakes that are invariably in their own interests. Idealism versus realism. You'll grow up someday and realize how the world actually works. So you're referring to me or to other people in the chat or to the forces opposed to Israel. It's interesting that the most voluble, intense hatred of Israel may well come from a foundation of anti-white loathing. The only thing that holds the Democratic Party coalition together is anti-white hatred. Now, the CBS Morning Show did a hard-hitting interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates. So Ta-Nehisi Coates received much acclaim for his essay making the case for reparations that was published in The Atlantic, and for his previous book on white racism against black bodies. And he was working in an area that does not tend to attract geniuses, right? The smartest people on university campuses and in American life tend not to focus on issues like affirmative action, microaggressions, and the whole woke agenda. But Ta-Nehisi Coates, an essayist for The Atlantic, right, he received great acclaim for his low IQ arguments promoting a woke agenda. And what does wokeness means? Wokeness means that there are certain sacred identities, such as black or gay, that render groups immune from public criticism. That the white power structure has so victimized these groups, that the woke thinking goes, that they cannot be held accountable for their own behavior and they should be held immune from criticism. And I don't know about you, but I benefit from criticism because I have significant predispositions to be selfish, self-aggrandizing, to be lazy, to be duplicitous, to do what I want to do and not follow proper directions, to not adequately take other people into consideration. And I find that criticism has had a positive effect on my life. I just realized, wow, that was really inconsiderate of me. That was selfish of me. I was acting against other people's interests here. I was only thinking of myself, and I didn't take into account how much I was disadvantaging other people. I was not living up to my word there. Wow, that person just called me out for lying and duplicity. I realize now that I was trying to manipulate my way out of onerous obligations. So accurate criticism is a tremendous benefit, right? Accurate criticism makes me better. Accurate criticism makes you better. Accurate criticism makes groups better. So blacks, Jews, gays, straights, Christians, Muslims, right? Every group benefits from accurate criticism. And when the woke ideology holds sway, there are all these sacred groups, such as blacks and gays and Muslims, who are exempted from criticism. And those who are considered beneath agency and beneath accountability do not enjoy the same opportunities for self-improvement that other groups habitually receive. So both groups and individuals receive great benefit from accurate criticism. Now, if I were the head of CBS News and the CBS Morning News interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates was brought to my attention and I was required to pass a ruling on it, I would say that the interview had problems. So I don't take the knee-jerk conservative response that it was just a good, hard-hitting, strong interview of Ta-Nehisi Coates. Right? There is a proper protocol that saves lives when it comes to airplane takeoffs and airplane landings. There are proper protocols that save lives with regard to healthcare. Right? Protocols are useful in many areas of life. And there are proper protocols that lead to more effective, more revelatory interviews. And so, if you state your opinion in the interview, if you state strong moral judgments in the interview, like the CBS News host did, then you're going to put the other party on the defensive, and when the guest feels on the defensive, they are going to shut down. They are going to return to talking points, and you'll have an inferior interview. So this is par for the course in the mainstream media. Now, my assessment of myself is that I am in the top 1% of interviewers. I think I'm excellent at interviewers, but I see in the mainstream media, they often glorify and trying to look tough, but they do it by manipulation, stating moral judgments, and not asking open-ended questions, and it just produces inferior interviews, though it makes them look strong and tough. So Mike Wallace, for example, has done a lot of interviews that made him look strong and tough, but they came at the price of the interview quality. Right? Mike Wallace, in his own mind, was a great tough interviewer. And I just read a book. What was it that said? The author said that she considered Mike Wallace the greatest interviewer. Mike Wallace is a terrible interviewer because he would interject his own moral judgments and ask closed questions, yes or no questions, that did not result in interview subjects disclosing very much. And so CBS News, by interjecting all sorts of unnecessary moral judgments into the interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, unnecessarily put him on the defensive and reduced the value of the interview. Ta-Nehisi Coates was not nearly as free and open with his answers as he could have been with a more informed and wise interview approach. So anytime you're in a conversation and you want the other person to open up, right? Ask open-ended questions, not yes/no questions that could be answered with a yes or no. Hold back from giving your opinion, and particularly hold back from making moral pronouncements. Right? The more judgmental you come across, right, the more other people are going to shut down. So for me, there are a few things more intoxicating than when other people are open and honest. Right? When other people are open and honest, I want to be open and honest, and it's energizing, it's freeing, and you can't work through and process many issues until you're able to talk about them openly and honestly. And then once you can talk about problems in your life openly and honestly, you can begin to heal them. And it's as though the molecules in the air change when people are unexpectedly honest. It's a beautiful thing to facilitate that kind of openness. So I watched a terrific video last night on YouTube about this Iranian island that is absolutely essential for its oil exports. And if Israel wanted to, it could take out this island, and that would shut down 80 to 90% of Iran's export earnings. So why the heck? Why doesn't Israel do this? And Joe Biden has made clear he doesn't want Israel to attack Iran's nuclear facilities or its oil facilities. Where am I? Right, this is Westwood in Los Angeles. I'm near the campus of the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA. So just a small turnout, as I understand it, for the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel crowd yesterday at UCLA. I think there was a bigger turnout for that crowd at USC, which is in downtown Los Angeles. This is West Los Angeles. As an American, I can judge Israel and offer constructive criticism. Strong allies is essential. Luke, have you seen the channel Soft White Underbelly? I'm not sure that I have. So a channel that I've gotten into over the past couple of weeks, I think is called Man Talk. So why doesn't Israel destroy the island? I think it's Kaj Island, that is essential for Iran's oil exports. Well, it's not just that that would shut down Iran's oil exports. It's that when you act against someone else, right, they don't usually just accept your actions passively. Right? We take stands, we wear yarmulkes, we sing songs, we act and speak in certain ways, and then other people respond to us. And so if Israel stopped and blew up Iran's capacity to export oil, then Iran would retaliate and stop surrounding Sunni Arab nations from exporting oil. And then that would double and triple the price of oil, crash the world economy, and possibly crash the American economy at the same time. Now, America would seem to be far better placed to survive the doubling and tripling of the price of oil because because the United States is a net energy exporter. But according to this video, anyway, if Iran retaliated, shut down oil exports from surrounding Sunni Arab nations, and the price of oil tripled, this would crash the world economy, and other nations would have less ability to secure the American dollar, and that this would crash the American economy at the same time. So that's the reason why Israel may not take out and destroy Iran's oil infrastructure. And with regard to Iran's nuclear structures, Israel could certainly damage them, but it might perversely incentivize Iran to make it its top priority to create a nuclear weapon. And from the analysis that I've seen, if Iran decides to make it the number one priority that they must develop a nuclear weapon, there is nothing that any outside power, including the United States, can do to stop them unless there's a regime change. And according to the conventional analysis that I read, the more that Iran is bombed and attacked by outside forces, right, the less likely you are to get regime change, because the natural human instinct when your nation state is attacked is to rally around your nation state. So according to this conventional line of thinking, the best hope for regime change in Iran is that it comes within the current leadership structure, because there are no outside forces right now that appear capable of governing Iran. Please pray for us in Central Florida. Am I Jewish? Yes. I am a convert to Orthodox Judaism. I was raised a Seventh-day Adventist Christian. And the identity that has the most influence over my life, and the identity for which I make the most sacrifices and display the most intense commitment, is to my Orthodox Jewish identity. So I don't live stream on the Sabbath or on Jewish holidays. I don't work on the Sabbath and Jewish holidays. Most of my closest friends are Orthodox Jews. So the word kihila, synagogue, right, the Hebrew word for synagogue, kihila, right, it means meeting place. So a synagogue in function is not primarily a house of prayer or a house of Torah study. It's primarily a place of meeting. And so a great deal of my life revolves around the Orthodox synagogues that I attend and the communities that I've built and participate in through those synagogues. So Central Florida, yes, appears to be the recipient of a massive hurricane, and I used to live in Central Florida. So in the summer of 1992, right, I had chronic fatigue syndrome by that point for 4 years, and I was living in an isolated part of Northern California in Newcastle, out in the country. My parents had 7 acres of land. We lived in zip code 95658. It was about 45 minutes drive north of Sacramento up Interstate 80. And I was very lonely because people my own age, by and large, would shy away from me because it's disturbing when you're in your early 20s and you have a friend and a peer who is apparently struck down by some kind of malady that doesn't have a definitive medical test. People don't understand chronic fatigue syndrome. It doesn't make much sense. And so when someone young struck down with that kind of illness, it is disturbing, and it has the taint of contagion, and you want to stay away from that kind of dysfunction. By contrast, I found that people in their second half of life were almost always far more empathic than people my own age and younger. So I was very lonely, and I had renewed via the mail an acquaintance who was getting his PhD at Loma Linda University in Christian ethics. And he wrote to me that I feel like your greatest need in your life right now is for community. And I said, yeah, that's what I need. And so one of the things that I did to build community was that I started madly responding to and placing singles ads in both Jewish and secular publications. And so I met a string of women, and I had an acquaintance who lived in Orlando, Florida, and she sent me the local Jewish newspaper, and I placed singles ads in it and responded to singles ads in it. And I met a woman who was 11 years older than me, who was quite attractive. I was about 26 at the time. She was 37. She had a chronic illness of her own, and we bonded over the phone. And she fell in love with me over the phone, and then she came out to visit me, and we decided to make a go of it, and I flew back with her to Orlando, Florida. I lived in Orlando for 8 months, and I lived across the street from a conservative synagogue, Ohev Shalom. So I lived in Florida from something like August of 1993 until March of 1994. Then I moved to LA. Because in late January of 1994, I met Dennis Prager in person for the first time when he was a scholar in residence at a conservative and reform synagogue in Tampa Bay. And he said, hey, if you're ever in LA, I might have work for you. So I thought, I'm going to move to LA. I'm going to work for Dennis Prager. Dennis Prager promotes ethical monotheism. It's the best method for making people more ethical and more sensitive and compassionate and empathic. I want to devote my life to God. And I told Dennis, I'm going to devote my life to God. He says, well, do it moderately. So if you're going to have a guru, you're going to have a hero, you're going to have a role model, right? Dennis is a pretty good one because he's a pretty moderate bloke. And so I moved to Los Angeles. And then the job with Dennis Prager didn't work out, and that was either for the stated reason that Dennis had run into additional expenses providing health insurance for his employees, and he couldn't afford to bring on any more employees. That was the stated reason, or the unstated reason was that Dennis and company saw this guy is not worth bringing on. So when I interviewed with Dennis Prager's right-hand man at the time, Mark Wilcox, I think I rubbed him the wrong way. How well infiltrated is Iran by Mossad? Many indications that it's highly infiltrated. Do I debate? Sure. So just send me an email, lukeisback@gmail.com. I have an irrational fear of Florida. So I knew many Jews who'd moved to Florida and they had contempt for the average IQ of Floridians. And there's this line that they would trot out. These were New York Jews who'd moved to Florida. Who put the duh in Florida? How are Dennis and Julie? 40 could have been Julie. I have stopped watching. So I think what did it for me were the conspiracy theories that Julie was espousing after the Trump shooting that I thought did not stand up to scrutiny. Now, how different were they from my own conspiracy theorizing about that Trump shooting in the early days after that Trump shooting? Right. Well, at least to my mind, my questions were valuable and insightful, and hers were not. But after hearing her conspiracy theorizing about the first Trump shooting, I stopped watching Dennis and Julie. So I do a lot of things just by feel. I kind of go where the energy goes. So I don't listen to much Douglas Murray, even though I virtually agree with almost everything he says, because I just find that he's making right-wing partisan rhetorical talking point arguments that I'm usually quite familiar with. And even though his argument style feels good because it so closely aligns with my own worldview, I'm not that interested in consuming this type of right-wing rhetoric. It's not terribly thoughtful. And I generally agree with most of the things that most of the things that Dennis Prager fights for, but I find many of his arguments unimpressive. And I don't feel that I'm becoming more refined, more clear, more educated by listening to people like Douglas Murray and Dennis Prager, even though I agree with them. So I would rather be challenged by some left-wing intellectuals and hear things from points of view that I would not have considered, even though it's not as easy, it's not as pleasant, it's not as emotionally pleasing, it's not as comforting, it's not as comfortable to listen to these left-wing perspectives. At least I'm getting challenged and I'm learning something. So I'd say 2/3, probably somewhere between half and 2/3 of the podcasts that I've listened to over the past month have been about Israel's wars. And over the past 2 weeks, it's been probably, 70%, 75% of the podcasts I've listened to are about Israel's conflict with Iran. So I heard something fascinating that I started developing in an essay this morning. So I woke up at 3:18 a.m. and I knew I needed sleep. But I also knew that I had this essay that I wanted to work on. And I lay there in bed until 4:11 a.m. when I just gave up. Said, okay, haven't had enough sleep, but I'm going to have that rare cup of coffee. I'm going to have my Adderall. I'm going to work out this darn essay on the following topic. How much does your politics feed through or result from your cognitive structures and physiology? So remember the two Donald Trump presidential debates. There was one June 27 with Joe Biden, then there was one in September with Kamala Harris. Remember the mannerisms, the tone, the self-presentation, and the physiology of the anchors of these debates, particularly of the ABC debate. Right, there was just something that I found smug, condescending, stilted. These moderators, including the CBS moderators with the vice presidential debate on October 1 with J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, there was something particularly in, is it Margaret Brennan of CBS? It was just so stilted that it seemed to embody the downsides of elite discourse, of new class discourse. So if you want to sound like you're a member of the elite and that you're properly educated, there's a certain way that you speak that was embodied by ABC News in the Trump-Harris debate, by the anchors on that debate, and embodied by Margaret Brennan in the CBS J.D. Vance versus Tim Walz debate. And it is a careful way of speaking. So you would not say that somebody is senile. Right? In this careful, new class, elevated, elite discourse, you don't say Joe Biden is senile, you don't say anyone is senile, because senile is a pejorative term that casts older people in a bad light, and you don't want to be ageist. So instead of saying that someone's senile, you might say that they appear to have cognitive difficulties. And you don't say someone's a retard, right? You say that someone's acting maladaptively or speaking in an uncouth manner. And you don't call gay people the F word. Right? There's an elevated style of speaking which has its advantages. It's a discipline. It probably minimizes unnecessary harm with words, and minimizing harm with words is a virtuous goal, but it comes at the expense of honesty and openness and clarity. Right? The more polite you are, usually the less truthful and clear you are. And both courtesy and truth are good things. And so it's not as though one can just pursue truth and completely ignore the virtues of courtesy. Right? You can't pursue one without regard to the other, because all virtues exist in a constellation. And so I was struck by something that Gadi Taub said in his show Israel Update. Gadi Taub is a right-wing Israeli historian and social commentator. And his partner on the show, Michael Doran, is a Middle East expert for the Hudson Institute, and both these people are right-wing and generally positive towards Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli right and Israel's current war strategy. And so they have a segment towards the end of their Israel Update programs where they pick out stupid media commentary of the past week. And Gadi Taub picked out commentary by Ilana Dayan. So Ilana Dayan is originally from Argentina, and she's been called the Barbara Walters of Israeli TV, and she speaks in a particularly elevated Hebrew accent, and she is a quintessential embodiment of the Israeli elite that feels often more in common with members of the elite in Europe and the United States than with their fellow Israelis. So many members of the elite, whether they live in Singapore, Australia, United States, France, Germany, England, right, feel more in common with other members of the elite than they do with their own citizens. And so Gadi Taub, this right-wing populist Israeli commentator, was mocking her elevated Israeli accent and her knitted, furrowed brow and her rimless glasses, and her embodiment of this particularly Israeli elite left-wing attitude. And he was picking on her performance as the interview subject on CNN when she was being asked questions by Christiane Amanpour, who's not Israel's biggest fan. And Christiane Amanpour said, how come the Israeli news media ignores the suffering of Gazans? We've got thousands of innocent, dead Gazan children, and that occupies almost no attention from the Israeli news media. And Ilana Dayan said, well, in Israel, we're living in the aftermath of October 7, 2023, attack by Hamas. It's still very much with us, when you had the largest loss of Jewish life in a single day since the Holocaust, and that has overwhelmed all other perspectives. But essentially, Christiane Amanpour, you are right. We should be devoting more time, more care, more concern, extending more empathy towards the suffering in Gaza. And we've been blinded by our own suffering to the suffering of the Gazans. And Gadi Taub was outraged. He says this is so common with much of Israel's elite. They feel more in common with members of the elite around the world than with their own fellow citizens. And there's not much sanity in Israeli journalism. And a sane response to that kind of question by Christiane Amanpour is that it is Hamas who's decided to hide behind civilians. It is Hamas that is solely responsible for Gazan suffering, that if Hamas would simply lay down their arms, this Gazan war would be over immediately. And by reacting to Christian Amanpour's question the way that Ilana Dayan did, you are placating these Christian-influenced anti-Semitic attitudes. And what grabbed my attention was his description of Ilana Dayan's physiology and presentation. And so I think that the type of politics we espouse shows itself in our facial mannerisms, our self-presentation, in our physiology, in our cognitive structures. Or I think it may work in both directions. So those with a particular physiognomy, meaning how we appear, and certain cognitive structures are more predisposed, more likely to be right-wing rather than left-wing, or vice versa. But also, taking on right-wing attitudes probably has an effect on your physiology, your speech, and your manner. So think about Tucker Carlson. Right, Tucker Carlson used to be a member in good standing of the elite. And when Tucker Carlson was a member in good standing of the elite, he would dress in a bow tie on his CNN show Crossfire. And he would display the mannerisms and the speech patterns and the physiology and the structure and the alignment of his musculature that was common to his fellow members of the American elite news media, even though he was on the right. Then, when Tucker Carlson entered his more populist phase and rocketed to success with his nightly show on Fox, I think he started demonstrating different facial expressions. His physiology seemed to change. I wonder if his cognitive structures adapted. He came across differently. His physical embodiment of his worldview appeared to significantly change from his days as a member in good standing of the American elite media as CNN Crossfire host. So look at pictures of Tucker Carlson as Crossfire host, and he's much more staid, right? Meaning more disciplined, more reflexive, meaning you're carefully monitoring your own words and behavior and trying to see things as other people would see you. And so he had more of the buffered identity, right, where you can construct meaning, purpose, and morality on your own, as opposed to the porous identity, where forces greater than yourself will flow through you and overwhelm you and lead to one moment a state of giddiness, and at another moment a state of despair, another moment a state of hope, and then a moment of rage, right? So the more porous your identity, right, the more you feel the world outside of you flowing through you and taking you over, right? The more varied and the more intense your emotional reactions, and with it, the more varied and intense your emotional expressions, your language, and your behavior, as opposed to the disciplines of the post-enlightenment buffered identity, where no matter what's going on around you, you feel that you have the powers of kingly reason on your side, and that you can construct a path that's good and right and pro-social and upstanding. And so I think there's a different physiology that goes with the buffered identity, which is the left-wing, secular humanist, liberal, academic elite way of experiencing life, as opposed to the porous identity, which is the traditional identity, the nationalist identity, the tribal identity, the right-wing identity. So Pat Buchanan, for example, is incredibly likable. And that's because he is much more spontaneous in that he has this porous identity. And so he reacts much more in the moment. His reactions, his emotions, his speech are reflective of what's going on right now, as opposed to a stilted, disciplined, buffered identity presentation. And so many talk show hosts have found that they have personally enjoyed their right-wing guests much more than their left-wing guests, because their left-wing guests are much more stilted and disciplined and reflexive in the things that they say and do, while their right-wing guests with their porous identities are much more present, much more authentic, much more raw, much more vulnerable. I want to draw down on this. So there were a couple of years where I flirted with a Marxist outlook, and I enjoyed provoking people by telling them that I was an atheistic communist. And my self-presentation was different in those years compared to my usually right-wing attitudes to life. I enjoyed the power and pleasure of conspicuous compassion for downtrodden groups. And so I wonder, are there physiological changes that come with adopting a more right-wing or a more left-wing attitude? Right? Does people's physiognomy change? Does their muscular alignment change? Because when you think a thought, right, it changes your muscular alignment, right? There is more tension in your musculature when you're thinking, as opposed to when you are free from trying to develop a thought. And emotions are most available when we're in a particular alignment of our musculature. And so if you are more porous in your identity and you are overtaken by giddiness, by hope, by rage, by despair, right, that is going to manifest itself in the alignment of your musculature, in your stature, in your posture, in your ways of speaking and being. So these things work in multiple directions, right? Your cognitive structures, your physiology, your thinking, your politics and your religion are going to affect your language and behavior and your emotions, and your emotions are going to affect your thinking, your alignment, your musculature, and your public displays. So I want to do a whole show on this. I want to dig deep into much of the conservative commentary on the two Trump debates of June and September of this year, well, particularly the performance of the moderators on ABC, right? There was a particularly stilted way that they spoke that seemed quite inauthentic and false and manipulative. Same with Margaret Brennan's presentation as a CBS News host for the vice presidential debate. So I want to look back and see the words, the language, and the critique and the description offered up by conservative critics of this moderation. Have I ever snorted Adderall? God, no. That's way too pleb tier. I take medication as prescribed. Never hear peckerhead in the mainstream media. To be continued.